So picture this, an empire spanning 3 continents, ruling the 7 seas, with a single dynasty that lasted for an incredible 600 years. That's the Ottoman Empire. And this is its story. A story of a superpower whose rise literally changed the world, and whose fall, well, its fall created the world we're all living in right now.
But you know what? We're not going to start at the beginning. Nope. We're jumping in way closer to the end with this famous and, let's be honest, pretty insulting label given to the empire by the Tsar of Russia, the sick man of Europe. How on earth did the world's most feared power become this? And this wasn't just trash talk. It was the central question of European politics for a century, the Eastern question. What in the world was going to happen when this massive, sprawling empire finally kicked the bucket?
Because that, right there, is the whole point. The choices made by this dying empire and the messy, chaotic way it fell apart directly shaped the modern Middle East. The ghost of this empire, it still haunts our borders, our politics, and yeah, our conflicts. So if you want to understand our world, you've got to understand this story.
Okay, so to really get how they felt, we have to rewind, all the way back to the beginning. Back to a time when the Ottomans weren't this grand empire, but just a small Turkish tribe, basically running for its life from the Mongol storm that was just tearing Asia apart.
Their origin story isn't about kings and palaces. It's about a prophecy in a tent. The tribe's future leader, a man named Osman, supposedly had this dream of a huge tree growing right out of his chest, its branches shading the entire world. He took it as a sign, and from that one vision, he laid the groundwork for the empire that would carry his name, Ottoman.
Man, those first 150 years were a wild ride. I mean, a total roller coaster. They shot up with incredible speed under sultans like Bayezid, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, who just crushed a whole European crusader army. Then, bam, 1402, total disaster. They were completely shattered by another conqueror, Timur the Lame. Their sultan was captured, the army was gone, it really looked like it was all over. But somehow, in a comeback that just stunned everyone, they clawed their way back from total annihilation and set their sights on the one prize that mattered most.
And the guy who was going to get them there was Sultan Murad's son, Mehmet. See, he'd actually been put on the throne when he was just a kid and had failed big time. He was humiliated, but that humiliation fueled this fierce determination. He swore he would come back and win the one victory that had eluded conquerors for centuries. Constantinople was seen as untouchable, especially from the sea, where this massive chain blocked the entire harbor. So after a long, grinding siege, Muhammad did the impossible. In a single night, his men chopped down a forest, laid out these wooden planks greased with animal fat, and physically dragged 70 ships over a hill and relaunched them behind the enemy's defenses. Can you imagine seeing that? The city was in shock, and on May 29, 1453, the 800-year-old walls of the Byzantine Empire finally came crashing down.
With Constantinople as their new capital, now Istanbul, the Ottomans became a true world empire. This next period? This is the Golden Age, the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. But it's also where the first seeds of the empire's eventual decay were planted. So, the military heart of this empire was the Janissaries. And what a paradox they were. They were technically slaves, boys taken from conquered Christian lands, converted to Islam, and then forged into the most elite soldiers on the planet. They had no family except the Sultan, so their loyalty was supposed to be absolute, and their skill in battle was second to none.
Now, to stop the constant threat of civil wars between a sultan's sons, Mehmed the Conqueror created a policy that was as brutal as it was effective, the law of fratricide. Basically, when a new sultan took the throne, his first order of business was to have all of his brothers legally executed. The cold logic was that the lives of a few princes were a small price to pay for the stability of the entire state.
And this system, as harsh as it sounds, it worked for a while. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its absolute peak, stretching all the way across 3 continents. His armies were knocking on the door of Vienna, the heart of Europe. And at the exact same time, his genius architect, Mimar Sinan, was building these breathtaking mosques that still define Istanbul's skyline today. It was an age of incredible power and just unparalleled beauty.
But back inside the palace, the rot was starting to set in. Suleiman's own wife, Hurrem Sultan, kicked off an era that historians call the Sultanate of Women. This is where powerful queens and concubines in the harem started plotting to get their own sons on the throne, often by getting rid of more capable heirs. And later, that brutal law of fratricide was replaced by something that was arguably even worse, the prince's cage, or the kafes.
So instead of being killed, a sultan's brothers were now locked up in a secluded part of the palace for life. I mean, just try to imagine that. You're locked away for your entire adult life, sometimes for up to 40 years, with zero contact with the outside world, living in constant fear that today's the day you'll be executed. And then one day, you're suddenly dragged out and told, hey, you're the sultan now. The result, as you can guess, was often a ruler who was paranoid, totally incompetent, or sometimes just plain insane.
And that's how the long, slow decline really began. The empire, which was once the world's great innovator, started falling behind a Europe that was changing at lightning speed. And its leaders, products of this bizarre cage system, they just weren't equipped to handle any of the new challenges coming their way.
The pressure was just immense, and it was coming from all sides. From the outside, you had Europe industrializing, while the Ottomans were largely stuck in the past. These new ideas of nationalism, born from the French Revolution, were inspiring all these different ethnic groups to rebel and break away. Then, from the inside, those elite janissaries, they'd basically become a corrupt mafia who could make or break sultans. And circling all of this were the great powers, Britain, France, Russia, just waiting, like vultures, for the empire to finally die so they could swoop in and pick at the corpse.
One last great sultan really tried to hold it all together, Abdul Hamid II. He was smart. He realized he couldn't fight nationalism with just a Turkish identity, because the empire was so diverse. So instead, he doubled down on his role as Caliph of all Muslims. His big idea was pan-Islamism. Let's unite all the different Muslim peoples of the empire under the banner of religion to fight back against the pull of ethnic nationalism.
And this policy was really put to the test when he was approached by Theodor Herzl, the founder of the modern Zionist movement. Herzl had a goal: to establish a Jewish homeland. And he made the Sultan an incredible offer: we'll pay off your empire's entire massive debt in exchange for Palestine. But Abdulhamid's refusal was absolute. He said the land was not his to sell. It was a trust that belonged to the entire Muslim community.
But his enemies weren't just outside the gates. They were inside, too. A group of Western-educated, ambitious military officers who called themselves the Young Turks saw him as an old-world tyrant. They overthrew him in 1909, and just a few years later, they made a fatal miscalculation. They gambled the empire's entire future by jumping into World War I. It turned out to be its death warrant.
Defeat in the war was total. The empire was occupied. Its lands were carved up and broken apart. And the ghost of that collapse is what we really have to wrap our heads around now, because it explains so much about our world today.
Get this. While Britain was busy encouraging the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans, promising them a huge independent Arab kingdom, they were secretly making a deal with France. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And with it, they literally just drew lines on a map, carving up the entire Middle East for themselves, creating the artificial borders of countries like Iraq and Syria that are still causing conflict today.
The final collapse happened fast. First, the Arab revolt shattered that dream of Muslim unity. Then, defeat in the war led to the Allies occupying their homeland. But out of those ashes, a brilliant general named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rose up and fought a war for Turkish independence, saving the nation's heartland. But to build a new, modern nation, he made a radical choice. The burden of the empire had to go. So in 1924, he officially abolished the 600-year-old Sultanate and the Caliphate itself, the spiritual leadership of the Muslim world, and sent the very last caliph into exile.
And just like that, the empire was gone. But the lines drawn on a map by colonial powers, the promises they broke, the power vacuums they created, all of that has defined the Middle East ever since. We are, in a very real way, still living in the shadow of the Ottomans. You know, the Ottomans didn't just fall because of their enemies. They fell because of their own arrogance. They stopped innovating. They stopped looking in the mirror. Their story leaves us with a really stark lesson from history, and a question that echoes for every nation, every power, even for us today. When you refuse to change with the times, time has a funny way of changing you, and it's often not pretty. The question is, are we listening?